the topic for tonight's debate is resolved prostitution or sex work is harmful to those who experience it. And this topic I just want to say a little bit about it before we dive in. The first thing to remember is we would encourage everybody to engage as much as you want to and with all of your passion, questions and speakers. And we would invite you to remember that this is a pretty personal thing. And so there are people, there will be people in the room tonight who have or are currently participating in sex work or prostitution who have experienced the whole range of, aspects of this. And so just keep that in mind as you engage. People always engage pretty respectfully here, but I just want to add that little reminder. Another thing is, just for the sake of clarity, what we're trying to get at tonight is sex work or prostitution that refers to real life encounters between adults. So we're not trying to talk about minors, pornography, or explicit trafficking situations, although I invite the panel to get into. Some people would say that there are a lot of gray areas here and it's pretty hard to actually distinguish those from one another, and that is definitely on the table for discussion, but just to sort of give us a sense of focus. And then additionally, I will at some points, and I wouldn't be surprised if others refer to the people who experience and participate in this stuff as women. I just want to say up front that that we know that it's certainly not only women, men, girls, boys, people of other genders are all experience this. And so I think that we will probably hear the shorthand women a lot, and know that we mean that with the full knowledge of the vast majority of people involved in this are women, but women or children. Sorry, I'm getting faces, reactions from the speakers, and so that's throwing me off. Anyway, all that to say, I just want to recognize that although we may speak in gendered terms, there are people from all genders who are involved in this. So you, like I said, are in for quite a treat, and I just want to take a second and introduce you to our speakers for tonight. So in the order that they will be speaking, I would like to introduce you first to Rita Hernandez. Rita is a PhD who has worked for 12 years on issues related to human trafficking for sexual exploitation and violence against women and girls. She has organized awareness campaigns, conferences, law enforcement, and legislator trainings to communicate the interconnectedness of prostitution and human trafficking and its connection to transnational crime. Today, Rita is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for Rescue Freedom International. She is a member of the Board of Directors of the International Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution and is the President of Mujer Libre, a non-governmental organization in Tijuana. Next, we have Caitlyn Bailey, who is a stand-up comic and sex worker rights advocate. She is the founder and executive director of Old Prose. Oldprosonline.org is that site, and we'll put all this in the chat for you, and is the host of the Oldest Profession podcast. Vanita Carter is the founder of Breaking Free, a nonprofit organization based in St. Paul, Minnesota, whose mission is to end all forms of prostitution and sex trafficking. Ms. Carter is also an author, sought-after speaker, trainer, and award-winning pioneer in the abolitionist movement. In 2016, Ms. Carter received the Lifetime Achievement Award from President Obama for the outstanding work she has done over the last 25 years to end the sex trafficking of women and girls. Ursula Ferreira is a queer femme, somatic sex educator, herbalist, and former sex worker. Her healing practice supports queer people to claim their core desire and live from the authenticity, vitality, and power of their authentic gender and sexual identity. She lives in the Bay Area with her butch partner and children. Melissa Farley is a feminist psychologist and researcher who has written a number of articles and 2 books about prostitution, pornography, and trafficking. 25 years ago, she founded the nonprofit research institute Prostitution Research and Education, or PRE. And last but not least, Alex Andrews is a sex worker with lived experience under criminalization of consensual sex work. She is the director of Woodhull's Human Rights Commission, ambassador to sex workers, and co-founder of SWOP Behind Bars. Alex has been working with men, women, and trans folks who have been incarcerated and also have lived experience trading sexual labor for whatever reason, and works to reduce the shame, discrimination, and stigma of sexual labor by showing up at community meetings and town halls that discuss trafficking, and using herself as an example to demonstrate that sex workers are just like everybody else. All right, so without further ado, I would like to call this debate to order on resolved prostitution or sex work is harmful to those who experience it. And we'll start with a 6-minute speech in the in the affirmative. And I am looking for Rita.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I want to start right off the bat saying that I was born and raised in Tijuana, Mexico. I am a migrant to the United States. And I think this is important because we need to understand from the very beginning that we are approaching our advocacy from a global perspective. This is a global issue. It's not just an issue for the United States or for a region of the United States, and that when we advocate for women, we advocate for women everywhere, all over the world. And as I have worked for the last 12 years in the red light district of Tijuana and the strips in San Diego, Imperial Valley, and Los Angeles, I can say that this is a very interesting geographical area because it has a symbiotic relationship one with the other. The Southern California depends on Mexico, and Mexico depends on Southern California. And so I think that when we compare prostitution in Mexico as a decriminalized and tolerated practice, and we compare it to the criminalized prohibition of prostitution in the United States on the other side of the border, what people in prostitution experience and live every day is surprisingly similar. And so I want to start with that because for the last few years, I have spent interviewing women, walking with women, talking to women, observing what's going on on both sides of the border, both in street prostitution, brothel prostitution, and others, gentlemen's clubs, et cetera, and the testimonies of women in prostitution have taught me that prostitution is really not about the free exercise of sexuality. Prostitution is a business, it's an industry. So when we talk about the free exercise of sexuality in the prostitution system, it only applies to the one that consumes and is able to buy. For women, it's a way of survival. So putting the body at the disposal of another, not for pleasure, but for necessity, for lack of opportunities, for deception, for taking advantage of a situation of vulnerability, of force, is really not about sexual expression. And this has just been my experience. So, however, it is very convenient to the sex industry to maintain the myths of prostituted women's freedom of choice, that she has control over her body and that her will is achieved through this freedom of expressing her own sexuality in this industry. And this is really something that I have not seen. So when we take into account this question of whether prostitution is a free choice or not, we really need to understand how it is that women enter the sexual industry or commercial sex. In reality, it's a construction that ignores 3 fundamental aspects. I would say 4. One, that 80% of women in prostitution were induced by someone before the age of 18, an age that is proven to have not developed the necessary maturity to make such a momentous decision in life, and that it's very easy to fall into deception or high-risk behaviors when you are at that age. And 2, in the vast majority of cases, the will of women who have freely decided to practice prostitution, this decision has been conditioned by external and internal factors that have strongly restricted the ability to really choose. This has to do with societal issues and stigmas and poverty and many, many other vulnerabilities. And 3rd, women who prostitute themselves do not do it for sex. They do it for money. When someone prostitutes themselves to survive, this does not develop their sexuality. So a study done of the region, a very recent study done by UCSD, of the Tijuana, San Diego region, which is really a region that expresses the multinational, the transnational situation of not only trafficking of minors, but of trafficking within the prostitutional system. Why do I say this? Because of the 600 women that were interviewed for this study in the region, 83.3% of them were instigated to enter prostitution before the age of 18. The average age was 16. 43% arrived at the region, at the border region, either Tijuana or San Diego, under duress. 36% of them had been raped. 66% had experienced a violent traumatic event related to a client. 75.9% had already ingested methamphetamines. 63% had experience with stronger drugs, and 16.7% were already infected with HIV/AIDS. This compared to 0.2% of the general population. So in the case of this region, Tijuana, San Diego, the field work carried out by Mujer Libre directly with the women in the zones of tolerance and the strips in the San Diego, Los Angeles area, it has been very possible to observe what we call the second tier of exploitation. So these are women that have been trafficked into these cities as minors, but then reach the age of majority and begin to generate lower incomes. And when they reach the age of 25, they are, left from their original traffickers, and that's where the real problem begins. And I will talk a little bit about that in my second intervention.
Right, wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Hernandez. I'd like to ask everybody to give some jazz hands to Rita for an excellent first speech. And I realized I forgot to say this earlier. In our style of debate, we have a tradition, it's not a rule, but a tradition of offering jazz hands, which is just our way of showing approval. And so I will be encouraging folks to do it at different times. And I would just say, even if you're at home with your computer, I would encourage you to give some jazz hands there too. I find it adds to the experience. And so we're now going to invite questions, and one little piece of instructions about the questions. In this style of debate, we follow a very simplified version of parliamentary procedure, which means that we will, there's a particular way that we ask questions. Essentially, I'm Madam Chair and will be for the rest of the evening, and you will address your questions to me. And so this is for anybody, audience or panelist who's asking a question. So it'll sound something like, Madam Chair, the prior speaker said XYZ. I'm wondering if she thinks, so you'll notice that was in the third person, da 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 da. So just with that little note, and by the way, it's okay if you mess it up. Somebody does it every time, and we love you for being our guinea pig. Yeah, so we'll take a couple questions. And so panelists, if you have questions, you can raise your physical hand. And I think we'll start with, and just for audience members, just so you know, we're not using the Zoom hands today. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and submit it through the Google form. The link is in the chat. We're going to start with Pam Gill. Pam, go ahead and unmute, and you may ask your question. The one about Sweden.
I'm aware that in Sweden, the only people that can be prosecuted are the purchasers of sex, not the providers. And I'm just wondering how well the panelists think that is working out.
It's a good question. All right, Rita, you have 1 minute to answer.
Absolutely. Well, we believe that this is the best model yet to combat the exploitation of sex. So we believe that women should not be criminalized. And this is the model that is followed in Sweden and 11 other countries around the world. And we find that when the penalties for buyers are raised, and there are extreme penalties for traffickers, obviously, and procurers, that actually sexual trafficking goes down considerably. But not only that, but the mentality of the community changes as well. So if just recently we heard the past ambassador, trafficking ambassador, Per-Anders Sunesson, just yesterday saying that they had a panel of young men that they interviewed, and 90% of them said they would never even consider buying a woman's body. So the law, the last 20 years, has also helped change the perspective not only of women, but also of men. And I think that that is something that is worth celebrating.
All right, great. And we will take a second question from Ms. Farley. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for that presentation, Ms. Hernandez. Do you have an,
You have to say, does she have? Go ahead.
I'm wondering if she has any observations about cross-border racism between Tijuana and San Diego, or do you have any observation, comments on that? Sorry, she.
There you go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we see is that women from the global South are brought to the border area. So it's not only Mexican women, it's women from South America, Central America, Africa, Eastern Europe. I mean, there's everything there. And so the minority populations, Black, obviously the Latin American community, but also the indigenous communities, both Mexican and US indigenous communities, are overrepresented by 80% in the region. And so, yeah, there is a lot of discrimination, and there's, you know, a lot of intricacies that go into that sort of thing. But we've had, you know, what we call pimps, and the women call the managers, come up to our team to say, what do you want? What kind of woman do you want? What color do you want her? What height do you want her? What color eyes do you want her to have? You have a whole array of menu to choose from. And there it is. I mean, that's basically what it is every day.
All right. Thank you. With that, Ms. Hernandez is thanked. Jazz hands for our brave first speaker. Yes, good questions and good answers. Okay, we will now move on to our first speaker in the negative. And for that, I'm looking at Ms. Bailey. Ms. Bailey, you have 6 minutes. Go for it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Caitlin. I live in New York City with my husband, but right now I'm calling in from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm down here helping to take care of my father, who has terminal cancer. I'm an only child, and I was raised an Army brat. And I think it's important to start there to understand where I'm coming from, and you know, I think it's important to understand everyone's background. So, you know, we grew up you know, traveling all over the world every 2 years, but my family settled in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where I mostly grew up. And I came of age under the Bush administration and his you know, the abstinence-only education, and was introduced to you know, some Southern fried nonsense about my body, much of it grounded in this very dangerous belief that women in particular are degraded both by the sex they choose to engage in and the sex that is done to them. And there's really no distinction made between seduction and rape. And it's a very similar conflation that we see now between adult consensual prostitution, which is something that is older than money, and this horrific crime of human trafficking that can sort of trace its rhetorical origins back to the white slave law, which was a tool that was used to incarcerate, you know, Black and immigrant men across this country, really since its inception in 1910. But I digress, and I get too much into history, which is my passion and my background. But this very dangerous idea that women are degraded, in particular by the sexual activities, either that they choose to participate in or that are done to them, is the foundation upon which misogyny sits. Now, I got into sex work as a young person from a place of privilege, coming from a place of curiosity and rebellion. And I used the internet and message boards to schedule and screen my clients. And I did that when I was almost 18 years old. And at 17, I was the same age that my father was, actually several months older than my father was, when he joined the army, very much against his mother's will. Now, we both disappointed our mothers, and society has told very different stories about the work that my father and I engaged in at the same age. But having had an opportunity, and as his only daughter, I've got to see up close what the Army has, and 4 tours of duty, has taken from my father. I've been there for the night terrors. I've been there for the, my father can't visit me in New York because the buildings are too tall and it's too triggering. And even now he is dying from cancer that is directly linked to his exposure to Agent Orange. So when we talk about the consequences of the labor that people participate in and the spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion that people engage in this work on, I think it's important to talk about the full spectrum of that. So I engaged in sex work in high school. Then I went to college. Then I participated in political campaigns. And then I got into stand-up comedy, which brought me to New York City, which is a very expensive place to live. And that's when I returned to sex work, which is something that allowed me to subsidize this craft that doesn't pay very well. And artists and entrepreneurs have been subsidizing their pursuits with this labor for millennia. In 2017, I started a podcast called The Oldest Profession, where every episode we did a deep dive on a different sex worker from history. And doing that work has showed me that I am not an anomaly. People with access to education, both social and monetary capital, have been engaging in this work for a wide variety of reasons for a long time, many of them writing autobiographies, many of them funding public works in this country. Madams were the largest landowners in the West for 100 years. So I think it's really important that we talk about the history that we've erased when we try to reduce this deep, complex, old labor into sort of stereotypes or flattened caricatures that fit into whatever our paradigms or our sort of pre-existing beliefs. In 2018, Donald Trump signed SESTA FOSTA into law, which is a law that tried to erase consensual adult sex work from the internet. And this was sold to the American public as an anti-trafficking effort. This is when Backpage was shuttered. This is when Craigslist erotic services went away. This is when Rent Boy was taken down. And that was really an activating moment for me, where I turned away from stand-up comedy and back towards sex worker advocacy. And I think it's really important as we engage in this debate that we're all very clear about what we're talking about. So having studied this for a long time, I will tell you that there are 4 basic ways of policing prostitution, right? There's full criminalization, where both buying and selling sexual services is criminalized, which is mostly true in most parts of the United States. There's regulation, sometimes referred to as legalization. This is what you see in Nevada. This is what you see in Amsterdam. These are the big brothels, right? And what that does is it creates licensing requirements that in order to engage in sex work, you either have to get a license or you have to work in an establishment that has a license. And what this does is it creates a barrier to entry. And what we've found everywhere that this exists is that barriers to entry are barriers to safety, which is why in Nevada, the only state in the US with legal, deeply regulated prostitution, it has the highest arrest rate per capita of prostitution in the entire country. The third model is something that was brought up in the chat, and Rita, thank you so much for addressing it. This is something that's called end demand, or the entrapment model, sometimes referred to as the Nordic model or the Swedish model. And it's the foundational belief that we can criminalize half a transaction. And what we've seen in all 11 countries that this has been implemented is that violence against sex workers increases. And the reason that that happens is because the negotiating power of sex workers is deeply diminished when their client is threatened with criminalization, right? So it makes it harder for providers to be able to tell the difference between clients, right, that are trying to pay them for a service that they are offering, or predators posing as clients. It's also a
Ask you to wrap
system.
up. Mhm.
Absolutely. This is also a system where you see sex workers are not arrested, but they are often evicted, fired, and lose custody of their children for engaging in this work. Myself and the other sex workers here are asking for the full decriminalization of sex work, where it is not illegal, you cannot be arrested, you cannot be evicted, you cannot be fired, and you cannot lose custody of your child for engaging in something older than money. Thank you.
All right. And with that, jazz hands for our brave first negative. And I'm going to have to insist, Melissa and Rita, that we're all going to give jazz hands. It is a rule now. Melissa, can we get some jazz hands? Spirit fingers are also acceptable. You can back me for now. That's fine. Oh, it's okay.
Jazz hands.
You don't do jazz hands.
No, I hate them.
Interesting. Well, maybe you can come up with a different creative alternative. I'll trust you for that. There you go. Yeah, blow a kiss. That works too. Okay. Lovely. So with that, we will move to questions. And I'm going to start with one that was submitted specifically for you, Caitlin, before this, just like when somebody signed up. And it is this, and I'm going to read it because the person, I don't know if they're here tonight. How do you think the arts can change our culture's views of sex work?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great and generous question. And it's the work that Old Prose is deeply involved in. We think that it is through art and representation that we can include sex workers back into the national narrative. You know, sex workers have always been a part of sex workers have always been a part of the story. And I think it's important for communities to remember, not only are we already your neighbors and friends and colleagues, but we have always been a part of these communities. And so I think telling our stories, specifically reclaiming our history, is a safe way to sort of prepare communities for sex workers to fully participate. And we have so much knowledge and so much experience to give to the communities that we're already in, but for this stigma, shame that silences us. And so I think that all of our lives can really be enriched by including sex workers at the table and in the conversations that are already happening.
Wonderful. All right, for a second question, I think I'm going to ask one, which I get to do every once in a while, which is, and I get to use the word you because I'm the chair and I can do whatever I want. The madam is somebody, someone joked. What I'd like to know, it seems to me that it might be difficult for us to create a system that empowers the people who are choosing this freely without at the same time creating a situation that is easy for those who wish to abuse to exploit. I'm curious whether you think those two things are in tension, and if so, how we would navigate that.
Thank you for your question, Madam Chair. I think that it's important for us to think about the root causes of exploitation and violence. And I think that, you know, the more that I do this work, the more I engage in this work, and I believe that this is something actually that you know, that Rita and many other folks presenting today would agree with, that the overwhelming majority of violence that happens within the sex industry looks a lot more like domestic violence than it does like, say, drug smuggling, right? Because sex work is a service, right? Sex workers are not commodities themselves. And so sex workers need the same things that domestic violence victims need, right? We need access to safe shelter, right? We need to remove barriers, access to services. We need to be able to report crimes committed against us without fearing threat or eviction or, you know, the removal of our children ourselves. So I think that if we talk about sort of raising the floor and creating services for all kinds of people, right? Not just people that are exploited in the sex industry, but people that are exploited in all kinds of industries or even within their own domestic relationships. You know, we want to create a stronger social safety net. That is the solution to trafficking, right? It's universal health care, it's funding childcare, and it's creating real, safe, viable alternatives for people that don't think that they have choices to go. This is not a problem we can arrest our way out of.
All right. With that, the speaker is thanked. jazz hands or kisses blown for our, this is great. For our brave first negative. Thank you so much. With that, we're going to move on to a speech in the affirmative. And so Melissa Farley, you are up. You have 6 minutes. Go ahead and unmute. Yeah. Mhm. You're still muted as far as I can see.
Okay, here we go.
There we go. Yep. Mhm.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Good to see you all. 25 years ago, someone asked if I would write a letter of support for a prostituted woman who was getting kicked off the San Francisco task force on prostitution. Why would the task force want to silence a woman who was talking about her experiences in the sex trade? They told her that she was too negative when she said that a pimp kicked her in the head with his steel-toed boots. She was too negative when she said she hated every minute in prostitution. I wrote a letter, she protested, but she got kicked off anyway. They didn't want to hear the voice of a prostitution survivor. I didn't understand it at the time, but I do now. The goal of the task force on prostitution was to put a sugar coating on this miserable institution. They wanted to message that prostitution is a good enough job for poor women, that it's kind of fun and sexy, that it's even woke and sexually counterculture. Norma Hotelling's voice confronted the lie with the truth. What's harmful about prostitution is the renting out of a woman's mouth, vagina, or anus, and what that does to her psychologically. Symptoms of emotional distress in all types of prostitution are off the charts. 2/3 of people in prostitution in 9 countries were diagnosed with PTSD. This extreme emotional distress is the same as the most traumatized people studied by psychologists. Battered women, yes, it is domestic violence, I agree. Raped women, combat vets, and torture survivors. If you imagine a pyramid with 5%, little tiny bit, 5% of the world's prostituting women at the top, and 95% of prostituted women at the bottom. I'm talking here about the 95%, not the 5% who have race and class privilege and who have more options for escape. The 95% are trying to survive in a racially, sexually, and economically unequal world. It's a lie that most women consent voluntarily to prostitute. The fact is 84% of adult women in prostitution are under third-party control by pimps, traffickers, and boyfriends. Another lie says that sex buyers are kind of nice guys who are sexually frustrated and just need a quickie to make things all better. In anonymous interviews, however, sex buyers tell us the truth. Quote, "She's just a biological object that charges for services." Quote, "If my fiance won't give me anal, I know someone who will." Sex buyers objectify and dehumanize the women. This allows them to ignore women's humanity so that almost any act of violence perpetrated against a woman in prostitution is considered trivial. Quote, "I was buying a product. They didn't exist as people. They were just whores." Quote, "Prostitution is like renting an organ for 10 minutes, one man explained to me. Men treat women in prostitution as disposable pieces of human beings. This is why women in prostitution say that they feel like toilets for men to masturbate into. When a 19-year-old is rented by a smelly man who ejaculates on her face and then throws a few dollars on the table, how does that feel to her? As she said, quote, "I feel like nothing." Nothing at all. Sex buyers are well aware of the devastating emotional damage caused by prostitution. A sex buyer from Germany, where prostitution is legal, explained, quote, prostitution is such a drastic experience for them. Their experiences with the ugly side of men is ingrained in their psyche. It changes their ability to have a normal sexual relationship. They're damaged from being in prostitution. Prostitution has to do with one person's sexual desires and the other person's economic needs. The cash coerces the performance of sex. But an elaborate rationalization exists in the minds of sex buyers. This rationalization about prostitution's fiscal benefits makes the harms of prostitution invisible to the public. Here's how it goes. Yes, yes, all prostitutes are exploited. However, they also have good incomes. Quote, this is a British guy in Thailand. These girls got to eat, don't they? I'm putting bread on their plate. I'm making a contribution. They'd starve to death unless they hoard. The Irish abolitionist Rachel Moran responded to this, quote, if a woman cannot afford to feed herself, the appropriate thing to put in her mouth is food, not your cock. Today, prostitution is about poverty and despair. Women in the US are selling blowjobs for a hamburger or a tank of gas. Women in Cameroon seek out sex buyers in quarantine hotels filled with European men who have COVID symptoms. Today, prostitution is about racism. Men select women according to sexualized, racist stereotypes about women, and predatory sex buyers exploit the economic vulnerability of women of color. The reason he has to pay for it is because she would not otherwise have sex with him. For most women,
Ask you to wrap up. Mhm.
for
You
most
can use your
women,
lessons.
for most women in it, prostitution is not sex and it's not work. The slogan sex work renames prostitution as a job rather than an act of violence against women. Prostitution is the business of sexual exploitation. Thank you.
All right. Jazz hands. Yes. Good. All right. So we will now move to questions. And I think we're going to start with one from Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan, go ahead and unmute.
Hi there.
It's the one
Madam
about
Chair,
addressing economic factors. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, that's for the initially for the first speaker there. But I want to know, how would prohibiting sex work address the economic factors that push people into sex work in the first place?
Good. All right.
Hey there. Should I answer that?
Yep, that's for you.
Or he kind of was talking to Rita, but oh well. I'm not in favor of prohibiting sex work. I'm in favor of offering women real alternatives, which in fact is what Kaytlin just proposed. I actually agree with that. If we had a universal guaranteed income in the United States, pimping would disappear for sure, and probably most prostitution. I don't think we'd see much of it. So once we have things that permit people to stay alive, an income that pays for housing and doesn't permit certain people to get rich because they're developing vaccines. If we had a guaranteed income, healthcare, childcare for sure, job training, and most of all, housing. I live in an area where most people can barely afford the rent, not to mention buy, and there's a 75% overlap between prostitution and homelessness. Don't forget that. If we provided women with adequate, safe housing, they wouldn't be turning tricks.
All right. And I'm going to just remind panelists to look at the chat because that may be how we're communicating with you. And you don't need to worry about it, Ms. Farley.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good. And the second question is this. It's from, this was a pre-submitted one. Is there an analogy between criminalizing sex work and criminalizing alcohol during prostitution? Would that lead to the conclusion that legalizing sex work would make it less likely that potentially vulnerable sex workers would be exploited?
That's an interesting question. It's a very common myth. And let me give you some information about Australia and illegal prostitution. The state of Victoria, Australia, legalized prostitution. And right afterwards, they had 100% increase in legal brothels. Not surprising, right? But guess what also happened? They had a 400% increase in illegal prostitution. Wherever the sex trade exists, we see a vast increase. For example, in the Netherlands and in Germany, we see a huge increase in illegal prostitution and pimping right next to it. In both countries, Germany and the Netherlands, where prostitution is legal, 80% of the entire sex trade is controlled by criminal gangs, international organized crime from all over the world. So I don't favor arresting any woman or man or anyone in prostitution ever. I don't think any of us, this is something that all of us on the panel agree with, by the way, Madam Chair. All 6 of us would say, don't ever arrest a woman in prostitution, period. But are we going to arrest the predators? Yeah. Let's don't call pimps managers. Let's acknowledge them for the traffickers that they are, and they need to be arrested along with sex buyers who drive the whole industry.
All right.
I
And
can
with that, our
see that.
speaker is thanked. Jazz hands once again for good questions asked and answered. So we are now moving to a speech in the negative, and we're going to go to Ursula. Ms. Am I pronouncing it right? Ferreira? Okay, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead and just unmute and yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Ursula. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. And, you know, just as I'm sitting here listening to each person, really to me, what this feels like is even more than maybe what I understand about Braver Angels in general, it's really trying, instead of being opposite each other, we're really trying to hold the many pieces that are very complex and have language and know how to meet each other. And so what I want to say is that it is not inherently harmful to trade sexual labor, but it is inherently harmful to be exploited. And I hear that from every single person so far on each side. And that exploitation comes from, you know, the patriarchal, capitalist, misogynist, racist, homophobic, you know, all of these oppressive views and systems that we are all living under. And so sex work has the possibility to be neutral. It has the possibility to be interesting, pleasurable. I will not say it's the same as a personal sexual interaction, but that does not mean it can never be pleasurable. As my bio says, I used to do sex work. I was an erotic masseuse, and I want to honor that I have a lot of privilege. I'm a white cisgender woman. I am queer, but I have a lot of privilege. And so the circumstances under which I chose to do that were really different than someone being exploited. And I do not think those should be drawn as equal, because the exploitation causes great harm to people who are treated as commodities, who are treated as disposable, who are also treated as dirty, right? And that's part of what's really causes harm which is not, I think, again, the sex work itself, but is the fear that many sex workers live under, the fear that pushes people who are doing it for survival work, for instance, or who, even if we choose to do it, how we may not be able to come out to people that we love, who we may fear our children being taken from us or our whole communities being exploited. So, and I want to give an example of, Kaytlin mentioned the effect of Sesta Fosta. And here in California, in the Bay Area, there used to be a website called Redbook. And Redbook operated as a place for men to find women working, but it had a second back, which was called Pink Book. And Pink Book was where the women would communicate with each other, and men actually had to have referrals to see anyone. We would actually call each other up and make sure that this person was not a creep, was not going to harm us. And so not so much in response to the other, panelists who have been speaking so eloquently, but to the people listening who probably don't have a lot of experience with sex workers or knowing who that's your neighbor might be one, know that, the laws that make it harder for us to be upfront, to communicate with each other, to have these systems where we can actually be safer, that only harms people, that harms us, that potentially harms our children and our families. And that, to think about what is the lens that we're viewing sex workers through? Are we viewing sex workers through this, idea of Eve and women being the source of sin and being dirty? And so women are either like a seductress or a victim, and they can't have any agency. Like, to think about those things as we are looking at these questions, so that we can more come at them and think about what's the actual agency of the people involved in all different kinds of situations. And that's what I feel really good about the different people that are, we're speaking tonight, because everyone is talking about talking to real people. And that is what's most important. So my experience is real. And I know many people here in the Bay Area and, that have similar experiences of doing sex work that were not harmful. And that is not the only experience. So I'm really interested in making sure people have agency and a voice, stopping exploitation, and destigmatizing, consensual acts of sex in and of themselves, so that we can really see where the real problem is and pinpoint that, and offer people, create systems that support people to not have to do something that doesn't feel good, whether it's sexual labor or any other kind of labor that exploits our health, our well-being, our time, anything like that.
All right, very good. Jazz hands for Ms. Ursula. Thank you so much. So for our first question, we're going to go to Elisa Johnson. Elisa, go ahead and unmute. Your question is in the chat.
Hi there. I'm hearing a lot about the distinctions between those being trafficked and those who consent to sex work. However, the sex trade happens within the same system. And so I'm wondering, how do buyers tell the difference between someone who is being exploited and someone who is choosing to sell sex?
Great.
That's a great question. Oh, go ahead.
No, all you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's a great question. I think, well, one, if someone, and I don't have the full answer to this question, I'm just going to be clear about that. But I think that there's some things you can think about, and where, like, if a buyer is going to a procurer, I would be very suspicious of that person, right? So a good thing about, like, the way that when Redbook was up and other ones like it was that we were autonomous. We were working for ourselves. There was no one else in between. Now, of course, every person's situation was still individual. It doesn't mean there couldn't be anything like that, but it was much more likely that you were seeing someone who worked for herself. So that kind of situation, if there's someone in the middle, right? There's a lot of chance that that person is not in a safe situation. And you can't always tell, of course, if it's something online, but in this case, you know, we were all I know that we were posting our own ads. We were all communicating with each other, right? There was no one doing that. So there's no absolute answer to it, but those are maybe some things that can help you think about what might the difference be.
Mhm. Great. And panelists, I just want to remind you that you are invited to ask questions. You can raise your little real life hand if you have one. Kaytlin, or Ms. Bailey, go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was moved by Ursula's description that, we all stand here against exploitation. And, I was wondering, especially considering, the last question that was asked of, how do buyers tell the difference between an exploited worker and an enthusiastic worker? Can you think of, other fields where this, oh, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I'm wondering if Ursula can think of other fields where this distinction might be difficult, right? Thinking about domestic laborers or agricultural laborers or other people who are often violently coerced into their, often difficult job.
All right, go ahead. Yeah.
That's a great question. And it's actually that comparison of other exploitative non-sexual labor, something that I have been thinking about in preparing for this. And so the question itself was, how can we recognize that in other situations? Sorry. How we can recognize that same exploitation in other situations, potentially?
Yeah, or just speak to the existence of that exploitation in a lot of other forms of labor.
Absolutely. Right. So one that I was thinking about was actually, domestic help is one that's rampant, but I was actually thinking about the contrast of minors, right, who are often cisgender men, and how, on the one hand, are exploited, right? They are exploited. It is inherently a physically dangerous job. But because they were cisgender men, I think it's also valorized in the sense of like people sacrificing their bodies for their families to, there's this sort of like heroic narrative, and they are ascribed a certain amount of agency that I think sex workers inherently are not. Now, again, we know that both in both situations, there are coercive factors of economics and all of these things that we've all been talking about, right? But because of the way we stigmatize sex and because of the way we do not ascribe women, Black people, brown people, transgender people, queer people, of having agency, of being able to, actually be the subject of their own lives and not the object of someone else's fantasies and or fears, it really muddies the discussion. It really muddies the discussion. And I will say that I know of no sex worker by choice who does not, support the end of exploitation of anyone doing sex work out of any kind of coercion, right? And so, not that anyone else is saying that, but I just want to really clearly put that out there, like that is not something that I have ever seen. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we will take one more question, which this is sort of I think a question that some in the audience might have. And so this comes from someone who says, I have very little background knowledge about this subject. Among those who choose sex work and do not feel vulnerable in the work, what is the culture like? Are sex workers supportive of each other, body positive, etc.? Can you just tell us a little bit about that? So go ahead, Ursula.
Okay. I would say in communities like the Bay Area, where there's overall a lot of culture around sexuality in general, and so there's a more community around, sex work as well. Yeah, I mean, I had and have friends of all genders, super supportive of each other, very, in all kinds of ways. It's actually part of the reason why I was able to step into a work in a way that I felt like I had clarity about what did and didn't work for me, good boundaries, like what I was interested in, what the kind of reality was, and how to be like safe and clear in that. And the fact is that a lot of people who, you know, who are consensual sex workers, I'm just kind of making up that term for the moment, but just for the sake of discussion, also either simultaneously or, you know, evolve into doing sexual healing with other people, as I have, you know, what we think of more, but a lot of times people actually find that in that role, we are doing also sexual healing with people as well. Not necessarily every single person, but it is not an either or. The reality is much more gray that way.
All right, very good. And with that, our speaker is thanked. Jazz hands and kisses for Ursula. Yes, Miss Melissa, I feel bad saying this. We will ask you to express your alternative jazz hands whenever you are available to do so. Okay, so we are now going to we're going to take a short side trip to do a poll. And so Gretchen, if you would go ahead and launch our first poll. This is one of many ways that we make sure that the debate is sort of responding to what people are most interested in. So you have 1 minute to answer. Go ahead and vote. Panelists, you can vote too if you want to. Up to you. Alrighty, here we go. So it looks like people are interested in a lot of these things. Yeah, this is not a particularly like definitely this and not that kind of result, but technically we got the most votes for interest in creating an exit path for people who wish to leave prostitution or sex work. Next, the role of prostitution or sex work in a healthy, well-functioning society. But there's also substantial interest in services or other support to make sex work / prostitution safe and professional. The role of the state or legal system in permitting or decreasing prostitution or sex work, and decriminalizing sex work / prostitution. All right, we will go ahead and move on to our next speech in the affirmative. And we have a pinch hitter tonight, Leah Libresco. Leah Sergeant. And Leah, go ahead, you have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you so much for having me, April. I'll say a little about my background. I work here at Braver Angels on the debates team. I'm the author of Other Feminisms, a Substack community that's focused on a feminism centered on our mutual dependence upon each other, rather than pursuing a false ideal of autonomy. And oddly, most relevantly, I used to work a lot in finance regulation and protecting people from predatory lending. And that's where I want to start my speech for right now. Because one of the topics I worked on was the question of whether it was best for people to ban payday loans. Payday loans are exploitative loans that charge very high interest rates that roll over the loan frequently so that people wind up owing a lot more money than they've initially paid under terms that make it very hard for them to ever get out from under the cycle of debt. Now, one of the big questions here is always, what is people's next best alternative? There are some people paid for sometimes by the payday loan industry who will make the case that payday loans are actively good. But beyond that, a lot of the case for them is people pick them. So even if they're not a very good option, they're the best of a suite of bad options, and taking the best of bad options off the table for someone doesn't leave them better off. And in some ways, I think that's the argument for survival sex work. It's not that it's a good option, it's that it's the best of a series of options, and absent a way like a UBI to kind of give people a much better alternative, it's unfair to take away the best of the options they have on the table. So why would I do it? Why would I do it for payday loans? Why would I do it for sex work? And the answer is because there are some things that shouldn't be sold, that shouldn't be on the table, even if they are the best of bad options. And when they are, we have to address providing a better option rather than harming both the people directly involved in the marketplace, but harming all of us by making a society that says, this is something we can sell. We have economic options we take off the table, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. Child labor is strictly regulated to borderline illegal, even when it might help people in very difficult circumstances. Because we've decided as a society, allowing people to pull their children out of school and sell their labor is inherently exploitative. It cuts against what childhood is. Even if it helps an individual person, it's a value judgment we can't stand by as a society. We limit whether kidney donors can be compensated for donating a kidney, and that's one I don't agree with, but the argument is similar. We have to be very careful what we're willing to put a price on, because even saying something can be sold is a profound statement about what it is. And that brings us to sex. What does it mean to say a woman's body or a man's body is a commodity? What does it mean to say a sexual encounter is something you can pick off a menu or negotiate for primarily through money and then leave? I want to quote something from Lewis Hyde, who's kind of a philosopher of art and exchange, where he's just talking about, what he says is, the first time I went to a rare book fair and saw how the first editions of Thoreau and Whitman and Crane had been carefully packaged in heat shrunk plastic with price tags on the inside. Somehow the simple addition of airtight plastic bags had transformed the books from being vehicles of liveliness into commodities, like bread made with chemicals to keep it from perishing. In commodity exchange, it's as if the buyer and the seller were both in plastic bags. There's none of the contact of a gift exchange. There's neither motion nor emotion, because the whole point is to keep the balance, to make sure the exchange itself doesn't consume anything or involve one person with another. And that's what we tend to look for in a market economy. We look for a way to not have a relationship with the person we're purchasing from. I go to the grocery store, I buy oranges, I don't know the cashier. I finish my relationship when I leave. That's what money enables us to do, to end the transaction at the point of sale. But that's not what sex is, fundamentally. There's the emotional entanglement of sex, but there's always the possibility, when a man and woman specifically come together, that there will be an entanglement between them, an entanglement that's a person, that involves both of them, that lasts long after money has been exchanged. And when we say that sex is something that's a commodity that can be bought and sold, we're saying it's something where we can trim off anything that lasts beyond that initial consensual paid for encounter. Something where we can kind of make it small enough and controllable enough that it can have a clean ending. And I think that's factually untrue. And when we kind of make that untruth the law by regulating sex work, by calling it a kind of work at all, we're telling an untruth that doesn't just harm the people who purchase sex and the people who sell sex. It harms all of us, because that idea of sex as commodity infiltrates and shapes how men and women come together when no money is being exchanged, but simply when people meet up for a one-night stand and say, this can end cleanly, and we have total control over how it ends. This is sealed off, sanitized, transactional. And factually, that's not what sex is. Even if you are kind of open to ending things or ending a child that results from sex, there still is a child to make a choice about. Sex is too open-ended to be treated as a commodity that can be bought and sold and priced. Thank you.
Forgive me. You all did the jazz hands and the jazz hand alternatives without me even asking. Well done. So I would like to move to questions, and we will start with one from Ms. Farley. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I want to say how sad I am that Vednita Carter is ill. And I want to appreciate the speaker for jumping in and delivering such an amazing last second speech. My question, Madam Chair, is this. Does the speaker have anything to say about the harmfulness of commodification generally? It was important to me to hear what she had to say about commodification in the sex trade, turning people into objects. But how about all the research on commodification? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous generally. I think it's a move towards commodification that we should start to have more of a reflexive suspicion of, but particularly when it's for something as intimate as a human person, a body, and the potential of new life. And I've kind of centered this on the generative potential of sex, but the emotional potential as well to commoditize is dangerous. But this is something that should inform a lot of the ways we approach things we are more comfortable buying. I did casually mention buying oranges at the grocery store, but there's a reason a lot of people want to move to a farmer's market or a supply chain they understand better, because a lot of us are involved in enforced slavery when we buy our clothes, when we buy products made in the Uyghur regions of China, where we know that kind of the suffering that goes into the commodities we buy has been made invisible to package it simply for us. And I think a lot of people bring that level of suspicion to something like buying a pair of jeans and not to camming, where again, the exploitation may happen off camera, just like the suffering of farmers happens far from the store you buy your pants in. But we should expect a lot more of the things we buy have sordid histories that we want to disassociate ourselves from.
All right, very good. And we will now go to a second question from Tara Burns. Tara, go ahead and, you've already unmuted, and it's your question about the Canadian Supreme Court decision.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Leah's point really spoke to me because I remember I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, the Canadian Supreme Court took up this same question, and they decided that the physical harms that happen to sex workers under criminalization cannot really be outweighed or overcome, or rather the moral discomfort of other people should not take priority over the safety of sex workers. And I wonder what Leah would say to those Supreme Court justices.
Great, thank you.
I do favor as the best, again, of kind of media models, the model of criminalizing the buying of sex, but not the selling of it. Because I want people who are in a difficult situation to have as easy a time as possible going to the authorities or leaving without any worry that they'll be in trouble for the part they've played. And that goes everything from decriminalizing the selling of sex in order to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable are not the people who are harmed, to decriminalizing some of the ways that police prey on sex workers by charging them for carrying too many condoms. I don't want any part of that to be illegal. In the same way, I don't want any part of being homeless to be illegal, an additional way to come into contact with law enforcement in a very vulnerable moment. Public urination is something that is difficult, but is seldom a choice people are making because it's a great choice they're thrilled about, but because all other options are closed to them. So, looking at those models of where do we try and make sure the vulnerable are not criminalized for the crime of being vulnerable or for the crime of having doors closed to them is where I would start. And unfortunately, as kind of the example of the homeless indicates, there are fewer of those models than you'd think. A lot of kinds of vulnerability are criminalized in America.
All right. And with that, our speaker is thanked. Jazz hands and jazz hand alternatives for Ms. Sargent. I do just want to give her invite us to give her an extra round of jazz hands in a moment, because behind the scenes, one of our speakers is very ill and we haven't been able to reach her. And it seems like either there's a technical problem or we're not sure, Vanita Carter. But we look forward to bringing her to you another time. And for the moment, Ms. Sergeant agreed to come in and give a speech on very short notice. So one more round of jazz hands / jazz hand alternatives, yes, for Ms. Sergeant. Okay, and we will now go to the speech in the next speech, which is in the negative. So Ms. Andrews, go ahead and unmute. You have 6 minutes.
Unmuting is always challenging. I'm Alice Andrews. I am a longtime ambassador on sex work, and I am the director of the Human Rights Commissions for the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. I am also co-founder of the Sex Worker Outreach Project Behind Bars, and I've been a sex worker since 1984. I have lived experience under the criminalization of prostitution. I am a survivor of exploitation and domestic violence, and I am an advocate for all people who trade sex regardless of their circumstance. My work over the past decade is centered on people who have been incarcerated in prisons and jail around the country and beyond. I work with marginalized and vulnerable populations and many who have experienced unspeakable violence for their work within the sex industry. And I've discovered that much like myself, as a person who has been arrested for adult consensual sex work, they have found that the consequences of a lifelong criminal record has been far more harmful to their survival, greatly impacting their ability to thrive than the actual labor of sex work. I have administrated the 24-hour hotline specifically for sex workers in the United States for the last 6 years. I come to you on the eve of December 17th, the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. This is our 18th year where we as community members come together to remember those that we have lost the previous year. And we renew our commitment to the ongoing struggle for visibility and human rights for all people who trade sex. For nearly 2 decades, our community has dedicated months and endless anxiety to the collection and the creation of the annual memorial list. Each year, the search for names and dates, locations, causes, circumstances for each life and death reminds us that one day our own names will be on this list. The majority of violence against sex workers is not just violence against sex work, it's also violence against women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and at every intersection in between. It is violence against those who might not identify as sex workers, but rather as hustlers, survivors, or victims of exploitation. We also need to talk about those among us who are drug users, immigrants, or migrant workers. We can't end the marginalization and victimization of all people who trade sex without also fighting transphobia, racism, stigma, criminalization, drug use, and xenophobia. We cannot end exploitation by making it harder for vulnerable populations to access the help they need or to be protected by the very law enforcement and anti-prostitution rhetoric that hunts them. It is impossible to tell for any given person whether or not an experience is harmful for them. Frankly, it's not even the business of those talking about it. A person's processing of their own experience is only their business. And framing sex work as inherently harmful is harmful because it leads to stigma as well as harmful legislation and harmful public policy. A criminal record for prostitution has lifelong impacts on the ability to break free from being underhoused or homeless. A criminal record can keep someone from accessing an education, and it increases the chances that they will experience violence and exploitation. It's harder to get healthcare and access and food and clothing, and once again makes people more vulnerable to violence. Trying to assign blame for societal structures that lead people into the sex industry is not being of service to people who trade sex. We all do some sort of labor to survive, and it's not our place to tell another whether their labor is inherently degrading. Literally anyone doing any job they aren't meant to be doing, especially one where their labor and human rights aren't protected, will be at high risk of experiencing all manner of harms as a result of that work. Conflated stories of victimization help no one. We've seen evidence of this during the nonsense around the trafficking of children in dresser drawers and trafficking at a pizza parlor, the never-ending conflation of sex work and trafficking at large sporting events. And in fact, it really harms victims and survivors as well as sex workers. These are people in real crisis. Even the National Human Trafficking Hotline has repeatedly reported a spike in calls every time there is some crazy conspiracy theory that spreads misinformation and victims and survivors are left waiting on hold and going without critical resources and assistance when they need it. Coercive interventions to end demand for prostitution are completely useless. They're rubbish. They rely on false economic theory that reducing supply has any impact on demand. People who trade sex do not have the means or the opportunity to simply opt out of trading sex and take jobs that might or might not provide them with better economic circumstances. Arresting the clients of sex workers can result in lost jobs for primary income providers that then leads to the economic fragility of the familial structure. It creates hostile home environments that lead to children growing up in single parent households, which actually increases their vulnerability to violence and exploitation. We are not breaking the cycle of violence with this entrapment model of criminalization. We are perpetuating it. Anti-trafficking and law enforcement narratives cast a wide net into the sea in order to catch these traffickers. And they fail to see that when they cast this huge net without thinking about all the vulnerable people, like dolphins, who are like sex workers, who also live in this sea of economic uncertainty, they also trap people who are trading sex of their own volition, and this is killing them. We need to ask our society if it would be better served by taking reports from victims of violence, assault, and stalking more seriously, rather than asking them to justify their lives. There is solid evidence that the full decriminalization of sex work, as seen in practice in New Zealand for almost 2 decades now, reduces violence, creates better access and opportunities, and improves the health and safety of everyone who trades sex. Fear of law enforcement is no longer an issue for people who trade sex in New Zealand. In fact, workers are allied with law enforcement, and they don't fear reporting violence or crimes against themselves or others. I believe that people who trade sex should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the reason, regardless of how they identify, regardless of how our personal feelings. And when we state our desire to serve victims and survivors, we need to fully commit to recognizing that violence and exploitation does not take place in a vacuum. We have to have further discussions that actually result in resolutions about generational poverty, racial and gender bias, inequity, lack of access to healthcare and education, the disgraceful shortage of services and support for survivors of violence. And we have to talk about the over-policing of communities of color, migrant and immigrant populations, and the failings that we all share in forcing the criminal justice system to be the decider of who is a victim and who is a criminal. This practice puts everyone who trades sex at risk of harm. We need to elevate ourselves above rhetoric and the knee-jerk emotional responses, and work to create meaningful and thoughtful relationships with those who might have a different viewpoint, so we can do a better job in serving the people who need us the most.
All right. Jazz hands and jazz hand alternatives. Yes, for Ms. Andrews. Thank you so much. First, we'll go to a question from Ms. Sargent. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. My question is really on a specific point here, which is just the claim that we can't know what other people's experiences are or whether something is harmful for them. Because I think in daily practice and at much lower stakes, people have this experience all the time of thinking, you should break up with her, she's no good for you, you should stop drinking so much, and so on. So is it really true that we can't think something is harmful for someone and be likely to be right? In many ways, our friends know us better than we know ourselves and may have the perspective to say, this is a situation you should leave.
All right, go ahead.
We're more certainly free to think something about how another person might feel or react. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to impose our own judgment, our own personal bias, our own lived experience onto them. It's incredibly important that we allow people the opportunity to have the experiences that they want to have. And then we are there to support them if they fall. And I think that is the critical determination is, yes, people need to have the freedom to make choices that we may not agree with. That doesn't necessarily make them wrong. And that's perfectly fine. We need to give people more autonomy so that they can better live their life and find joy in whatever it is they end up deciding they want to do.
All right. And for a final question, we will go to Randy Leos. Randy, go ahead and ask your question to me.
All right, great. So this has been an amazing conversation that to listen to. It seems like there's a lot of agreement among the speakers about many of the principles about protecting people who are sex workers and making sure that they have support. So my question was, from a legal perspective, would it make sense to support laws that decriminalize both buying and selling of sex, unless it is someone who is selling someone else's act of sex? So if someone else is profiting from selling the rights to a sex or the access to a sex worker, that would be criminalized, but the sex worker themselves and the client would not be subject to criminal penalty.
Go ahead.
So yes, as a matter of fact, there already are laws against this. A third party who is forcing or coercing someone to engage in the sex trade is a trafficker. They are a criminal and they should be arrested. The point that we most often don't understand is decriminalizing both sides of this transaction have a greater benefit to sex workers and to the society that they live in. The end demand law in Sweden has been in effect for, I believe, 22 years, and the evidence is in. Sex workers are making less money. They have to negotiate quicker with clients. Clients are afraid. It's difficult to tell whether a client is scared or whether he's scary. So yes, absolutely. We already have these very serious trafficking laws. So that's never been an issue. We support we support the laws against trafficking and exploiting people. It's just that sex workers are always getting caught up in that net, and we would like to see that stop. So full decriminalization, both the buying and the selling of sex on a one-to-one transaction should be decriminalized. No one should go to jail.
All right, very good. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands for Ms. Andrews and jazz hand alternatives. Yes, very good. Okay, so we're now going to do a small section that, so we have discovered that we have resolved our tech issue and we have Ms. Carter. Yay! So we're going to adjust our timing a little bit, and Vanita, I'm going to give you a longer response speech and shorten the others. Before we do that, I'm just going to ask a couple questions for the intervening segment, which is moderator questions. And so these are questions that reflect just either things that I've noticed as I've been listening to this spectacular debate, and also questions that have been in our queue that haven't been asked for one reason or another. A lot of people pre-submit questions, and we only get a chance to ask a few of them. So I'm going to try to represent a few of those here. So my first question is, several people have mentioned the Nordic model, which is, to put it simply, I'm sure there are small variations, but where we criminalize the purchasing of sex rather than the selling of it. And I'm curious if anyone, my impression is that this is sort of one of the more popular options out there for how to address this through the legal system. And I'm curious if any of you don't like that system. I've heard support for it from many speeches. Okay, so we've got a couple. So Alex, I'd like to hear just a little bit from you, and Caitlin, about why not? What's the flaw with it?
Partial decriminalization doesn't make any sense. You can't criminalize one half of a transaction. When Nordic model is implemented, sex workers are less safe because clients become in charge of the transaction. Clients are afraid that they're going to be arrested, so they act sketchier. It's difficult to tell whether a client is scared of being arrested or scary because he's going to hurt you. And that's a very important distinction. Since the Nordic model has been implemented in Sweden. It's been an epic failure. Sex workers are reporting lower income, and there has been no decrease in trafficking or exploitation. That continues to happen all throughout because sex workers are still afraid to come forward and tell people about violence, because then clients might be scared of them and face more ramifications. So no, we do not support of the Nordic model.
All right, sounds good. And then Caitlin, and then Melissa, you wanted to get in on this one too. And so then we'll move on to the next question. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thank you so much. I just want to back up everything that Ms. Andrews said is true. You know, the evidence really couldn't be clearer here. You know, the Northern Ireland's own Department of Justice gave a scathing report on the detrimental impact of criminalizing purchasers, you know, but not sellers, saying that, you know, the increased rate of homelessness among sex workers, marked increase in violence against sex workers, and a measurable increase in stigma against sex work. Because I think it's important to remember that the impetus, the grounding philosophy behind these end demand laws or entrapment laws is the eradication of sex work. It's really difficult to help a population that you loathe, you know, that you're coming at it with feelings of, you know, visceral repulsion and disgust. And so in a society or, you know, in a community where you're criminalizing sex buyers and you're characterizing people that engage in this work as mentally ill or self-harming, you're increasing stigma that has a lot of real world measurable impacts, right? People are evicted for doing this work. Right? People are fired for doing this work. People lose custody of their children for doing this work. They are surveilled by police officers, increasing exposure to law enforcement, which has detrimental impacts on, you know, over-criminalized groups because they are looking for clients. And there are a lot of laws around this, again, because they are all coming from a position of that anyone that helps a sex worker do sex work is exploitative, meaning the roommates of sex workers, the drivers of sex workers, the people that sex workers employ to help them screen their phone calls. This is a wide net that effectively isolates sex workers, and that's one of the things that makes them so vulnerable. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. And then, okay, I see that a lot of folks want to get in on this. Melissa, I'm going to let you get in and then we're going to go to the next question.
There's a lot of misinformation being presented here about the Nordic model law. There is no evidence that it does not work. In fact, one of the great studies on trafficking that's been done in the last decade comes out of the London School of Economics, who studied 150 countries and found that every place legalization happens, trafficking increases. In fact, Sweden, which passed an abolitionist law, it's not an entrapment law, it is indeed a law aimed at abolishing the institution of prostitution. And Sweden, which passed that law 20 years ago, is now the country in Europe with the lowest rate of sex trafficking. If you want to end sex trafficking, consider a law that does three things. First and foremost, and I think this is something we'd all agree on, provide real alternatives to women who want to get out of prostitution. Provide them with housing, job training. So number one on the Swedish law is the federal provision of exit services. Number two, you never arrest the woman in prostitution. We all agree on that. Number three, you do arrest the predators, the sex buyers and the pimps and the traffickers. And on the ground in real life, you can't tell the difference between so-called voluntary prostitution and trafficking. This is the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Children said this many years ago. Sigma Huda said, right, on the ground in real life, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between trafficking and other prostitution.
All right, so
thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So what's clear here is that there's, as is always the case with our best debates, there's some real disagreement. And it sounds like there's some everybody, I bet everybody feels the way I do, which is I want to go home and do a bunch of research now and like learn, like read these different studies and what the different perspectives are. And so if the panelists, some of you have sent us links to information. If you want to send other ones, you can go ahead and send them in a chat to me, and we can publish them at the end of this debate or perhaps in a follow-up email. So I'm going to ask one more question. And then, so we're doing a little bit of shifting our timing again to accommodate the tech challenge we had earlier. So I'm going to just ask one more question for the moment, which is I'm interested in, so I think we all agree that clearly we need to give people who want a way out of this and other exploitative situations a way out. And I'd like to know just if each, any of you who haven't spoken want to share something, excuse me, a particularly good example of that. Or like what, so I'm looking for like sort of, this is what's working and this is what I really believe in terms of helping people exit the work or, and otherwise be empowered. So I think I saw Kaytlin, and then, actually, we'll start with Rita and Vanita because you haven't said anything yet in this section. Go ahead, Rita.
Yes, well, the experience that we have on the street is that when women want out, that it's our responsibility, the state's responsibility to provide those exit services, and they need to be integrated services. And so when somebody else talked about, Alex, I think it is, just working on laws that expunge the criminal records of women is super important. Of course, a criminal record is a #1 obstruction to moving forward in a life that will provide for you and your family. The experiences is different for each woman. It needs to be services that are individualized to her needs. If she has children, if she doesn't have children, if she needs a place to live, if she needs temporary shelter, if she needs psychological help, if she needs medical attention, if it's just, you can't package it it's not a cookie cutter type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Sure, great, thank you. And then Vanita, you can have the last word on this one.
Mine is real quick. Rita really said a lot of it. I have found in working with women over the last 30 years that finding them housing, a job, the way to get their children back, getting their children back from child protection has been a great start right there. It's so hard for women in the life to find housing because they have these criminal records and no one wants to rent to them. So that, for me, has been one of the biggest things over the last 30 years. How do we end that? How do we get them housing?
Great, thank you. Well, I know there's a lot more. I have about 50 more questions for you all, and I'm sure the rest of the group does too, but we want to get you out of here pretty much on time. And so that will conclude this section for the moment. So I'm just going to give you some jazz hands myself for this, and for I just have to say I'm learning so much and loving this. And so we're now going to Vanita, you we're so sorry about the tech issue, and you undoubtedly had a lot to say, and so we're going to give you 6 minutes, and then we're actually going to shorten the other response speeches to 2 minutes. So we'll start with you. I put this in the chat, and then proceed as planned, but with 2-minute rather than 4-minute response speeches. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm going to talk about the harms of prostitution and the impact it has on the lives of women and girls. And I'll begin with my own story, because I know this story, because I lived it as a young Black girl. I never grew up with the ambition to perform sex acts for men who paid for them, contrary to the belief that Black women are born prostitutes. I have always said that little girls do not daydream about becoming prostituted women when they grow up. I dreamed of a life of advancement and freedom, a life of dedicating my life to God. In the early 70s, when I graduated from high school, I was excited about entering college in the fall. A friend and I wanted to make some money with summer jobs, and we found an ad. Girls were being hired to dance at a men's club in downtown Minneapolis. We showed up for an interview and were told that we'd be wearing lingerie. We didn't think much of it because we were less covered up sitting next to the swimming pool. Modeling as well as dancing and making the $1,000 a week, the ad promised. What could be better? In time, we were told we need to learn different moves and that we'd be dancing topless. Young and naive, we were told our bodies were works of art and that we should be proud to show them off. In time, I was being sent around the state of Minnesota and well beyond, not to dance, but to strip before leering men who were constantly propositioning me. I felt mired in something that was nothing like what I was promised, but rather a classic bait and switch. To keep going, I got into substance abuse. It started with alcohol and led to cocaine because I fell into what the world of prostitution calls the life. I, a good student with ambition for my future, I had quickly become someone I didn't recognize. Eventually, I was able to get back on track. I was able to look back at all that had happened to me while involved in the stripping industry. I realized that the stripping industry was just a stepping stone into prostitution. It was a cover-up that allowed men full access to leer, grope, to pursue with our bodies whatever they desire. Many people believe that just because stripping is legal, it is safe and abuse-free. My life changed. Although I always considered myself one of the lucky ones because I was able to escape the life of prostitution early, this is not true for many of my friends. My good friend that I got in the life with at age 18 didn't make it out so easily. She met a pimp while being a stripper, didn't get out until in her 50s. Then she died a year later. Over the last 30 years, I have worked with thousands of women, prostituted women. Less than 5% have said they enjoy the life, and none have nothing to show for their years in the life. Many people want to ignore the true harms of prostitution. In prostitution, you have to wear many different hats. You don't convince yourself and others that what you're doing is bad. I mean, you have to convince people, is what I'm saying, that what you're doing is not so bad. You like what you're doing. You have to convince yourself that it's not so bad at all. That's the only way you can do the work. Then the next John arrives and you go through the same routine. You put on that same hat to convince him it's not so bad. And it happens over and over again for each John that comes in that room. Then you go home, you look in your mirror, you put on a different hat. This hat is a real you, the one you can see who you really are. It's what you tell yourself about yourself when you're all alone. You curse yourself and you say, what the hell am I doing and why? You take your bath, you cry yourself to sleep. The next morning you go through the same routine until one day you just become hard. You just don't care anymore. Eventually everything just becomes normalized and you don't even see it coming. This is the inherent harm of prostitution. Your life changes. After you've been it, you just give up on yourself. I think Melissa talked about a lot of the mental health issues, the PTSD, and all of this that comes along with it. After working with the thousands of women that I have over the last 30 years, I'm convinced, I know, and with my own story, and I just told bits and pieces of it, the majority of women that I've ran into, that I know, those that work escort, those that work streets, those that work brothels, whatever, I've heard less than 5% say, I like this. I would want my daughter to do this. this is not so bad. But like I say, what the inherent harm of prostitution is to me, just the fact that it becomes something that just, it hardens you on the inside. A little piece of you gets taken out every time you're with him. We have to start telling the truth about this. See, the truth about prostitution is it's all about a sex act. We want to talk around about that, but it's not like having sex with your husband. It's not like having sex with somebody that you love, your boyfriend. It's nothing like that. It's about having sex with strangers, people that you may not know, that you may not give the time of day to ever. And think about 1, 2. I've talked to women from other countries who've told me that they've had to sleep with over 25, 30 guys a day. That is the inherent harm of prostitution, the way it changes you from the inside out. So it is harmful, mentally, physically, psychologically.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jazz hands for our speaker. Yes, and jazz hand alternatives. Mm-hmm. All right, so I just want to take a second, so we're moving into response speeches, and I just want to take a second and remind everybody here, visible on the screen or not, that this is intense and it's hard, and it's worth taking a minute to take a breath and remember that you have options. You can take a break if you need to. You can step away from the computer. You can wait and see if, I think a lot of folks have strong opinions, and we can hear that there's a lot of passion here, and that's good, right? That's good, because we all come here with good intentions. So just, I just want to acknowledge that as we move into the response speeches. So as I said, so here I am taking a breath. I think it's a good time for that. And if you're sitting at home, you can get up and stretch. And I want to go first for the response speeches. Vanita, we sort of combined all of yours into one. And so for the next one, we'll go to Alex. And you have 2 minutes, and you can just, again, these speeches are intended to be a response to what you've heard. It can be about a specific point, about the whole conversation, sort of whatever's coming up for you. So go ahead, Alex, 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. You know, regardless of how you feel about sex work, it's not going anywhere, and neither is exploitation. So we need to do better by the people who are suffering. These conversations are difficult, but they're critical. We can't have equity, we can't have safety, we can't have economic opportunity, we can't prioritize health, we can't reduce stigma, we can't fight discrimination. We're never going to be able to reduce the vulnerability of those who are most impacted using rhetoric and misinformation. We need to stand up for the 15-year-old child who is experiencing exploitation in foster care system that is broken. We need to stand up for the 20-year-old stripper in Texas who is suddenly without a job because of discriminatory legislation. Let's stand up for the people who are in prison and have experienced violence and exploitation as a way of life. We need to stand up for the recently released survivor who is going without desperately needed mental health care, and for the recently wrongfully convicted. We need to stand up for the sex worker who is running from a violent intimate partner, and a sex worker who has been struggling with a disability her whole life. Let's step aside and let them speak their truth. Let them tell us what we need to know to serve them better. Let's make sure that we're not underutilizing our most effective advocacy tool, that of listening and hearing the lived experience of our community members. The greatest experts on this subject are not on this panel tonight. They are on the ground, serving the needs of the hidden populations who hide because it's not safe for them to be visible. So does prostitution inherently harm those who participate in it, or is it the criminalization, the enemy we should be fighting? Let's not take our eye off the ball. We're not winning the war on trafficking by criminalizing people. We're perpetuating an environment that's only going to result in violence and exploitation, and it continues the cycle that is deeply rooted in our societies, in our institution, and our environment. Let's listen to sex workers, listen to survivors, hear their voices.
All right, jazz hands. With that, the speaker is thanked. For our next response speech, we will go to Ms. Farley. Go ahead.
Hey there, please don't invisibilize a survivor of prostitution who's speaking on this panel. We have a survivor, a woman who had the lived experience on the panel. Thank you. Do women have the right to live without the sexual harassment or sexual exploitation of prostitution? Do they have the right to say no to prostitution, or is that right reserved only for those who have sex, race, or class privilege? Anyone who knows about the daily life of prostitution understands that safety in prostitution is a pipe dream. Sex worker advocacy groups know this, but rarely talk about it. Here's a list of safety tips from sex worker advocacy groups in the US and in South Africa. Quote, while undressing, the prostituting individual should accidentally kick a shoe under the bed, and while retrieving it, check for knives, handcuffs, or rope. A Dutch legal pimp told a journalist, you don't want a pillow in the brothel's room, it's a murder weapon. A San Francisco organization said, wear shoes that come off easily or be appropriate for running in, and avoid necklaces, scarves, across the body shoulder bags, or anything else that can be intentionally tightened around your throat. Furthermore, the Australian safety codes, where prostitution is legal, recommends hostage negotiation training for women in legal prostitution. Many prominent advocates identify themselves only as sex workers, although they're women in the sex trade. Some are pimps, and some have been arrested for pandering, brothel managing, or trafficking. This misrepresentation is deeply unethical. Hiding behind the banner of labor unions, pimps appeal to the left's sympathies in the management of sex trade businesses in various specific ways. Robin Few,
Let's get a wrap up.
the founder of Sex Workers Outreach Project, was convicted of a federal law, conspiracy to promote interstate prostitution. The notion that prostitution can be provided under humane conditions, fully consensual, worker-controlled, free from discrimination, and no more exploitive than an average job is a myth. Once upon a time, to end,
when I have to cut you off, you can this is
Congressman
your last
Carolyn
sentence.
Maloney said there was the naive belief that legalized prostitution would improve life. But like all fairy tale, would improve life for women in prostitution and would remove organized crime. But this turned out to be fantasy. Sorry, I went over.
It's okay. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Yep. Good. All right. And so next we're moving to Ursula, but I just want to say real quick that there's a wide diversity of experiences here, and I really appreciate each of you coming and honoring those. So Ursula, I will go to you next. You have 2 minutes. And you're muted, sorry. Zoom, I know.
There we go. Oh, there we go. So I think that what is most prominent for me at the moment is just to really encourage everyone who's listening, because this is such a deep topic, it's such an intense and complex one, to really just sit with the complexity, to not look for a very, very neat answer. I mean, I think we can see there's bottom lines that we all agree that exploiting humans is not good. So there's some things like that, right? But even just our relationship to how we view sex inevitably has some deep implicit bias in all of us. So to just invite you in, we've had this gift of being able to hear these many voices, to be present together and hold them in a way that makes space for them. and to take that forward, because I think that's what's missing from a lot of these kinds of things. And sex is a heavily charged one. People's safety is a heavily charged one. Women's bodies, the bodies of marginalized people, are subjects that are heavily charged. So yeah, that's what it's really in my heart and mind right now. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. Good. Okay. And we will now go to Rita. You have 2 minutes. Go ahead and unmute.
Okay, so taking from where I left off, this young girl that is not making enough money for her pimp anymore. And she gets to be let go. And at that moment, it's her opportunity to get out. And what we've seen and experienced is that she starts asking questions. What am I going to do now? How am I going to get my children back? How am I going to feed these children? I only finished high school, or I didn't even finish high school. What am I supposed to do now? And I used to make, $2,000 a day for my pimp. Now I can do it for myself. I'm going to be independent. And then the system takes over. She decides to stay. And now she has to cover a whole array of expenses that the system makes her pay. She's extorted. She has to pay for the room. She has to pay for the condom. Even if the government is giving them out for free, there's somebody that's stealing them and selling them to her for protection, for the person that's getting her the clients, and all sorts of things. Our experience in the street and the brothels in the regions where we work are that women are keeping less than 15% of what they're charging. And to be able to just cover all of these nuances that are exploitative to her, she has to have, at least in the Southern California, Tijuana region, she has to have at least 20 clients. 20 clients. This will give her just the basis to pay everybody else for the permission to prostitute herself in this region, in this area. And so immediately she falls into the trap again of finding another pimp or another trafficker or another administrator or somebody else that can help her navigate all of these things, and then falls into another situation of violence and exploitation. And it just becomes a circle of violence and a circle of just this whole situation that makes her into a thing. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody cares. Nobody's listening to her. And so today I will tell you, I'm an abolitionist because of these experiences. I believe sex is a wonderful thing. I don't think women should be stigmatized for having any kind of sex that they want to have. I believe that everybody should have that freedom to express their sexuality with freedom. Women in prostitution. And we are talking, again, I'm not talking about the 5% that have this autonomy and that can make these decisions for themselves and that can have all of this privileged protection around them. No, we're talking about the 95% that are in harm's way.
Okay. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands or jazz hand equivalents. Yes. All right. Caitlin, take us home. 2 minutes.
Thank you. Before I started doing this work, before I started telling my story and working as a sex worker advocate, I had to come out to my parents. And when I told my mother that I had engaged in sex work, the first thing that she said was, "I can't believe that you sold your body." And I said, truthfully, I didn't. I still have it. I think it's really important for us not to lose sight of the fact that sex is not violence. Violence is violence. And we should believe victims when they report crimes committed against them. We shouldn't be imposing our own narratives on other people's stories. Now, look, there's been a lot of misinformation that's been pushed out today, and I don't need to take time to discredit Melissa Farley's data. The Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court and her own peers in academia have already done that, which is easily found on her own Wikipedia page. What I will say is that it is extremely difficult to get data from an actively criminalized and stigmatized group, but there are some things that we do and we can know, which is why Amnesty International, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the ACLU, and the largest network of service providers for trafficking victims, the Freedom Network, all support decriminalizing sex work, their clients, and their communities. Thank you.
All right. With that, the speaker is thanked. Jazz hands. So I appreciate everybody being here. This is a very important conversation, as you can see, and it's a tough one. And so due to that and the technical thing, we're running just a few minutes over, but I promise I'll have you out of here very soon, in about 10 minutes. And so now it's time for the last section of our evening, which is a really important one. And that's the one where we talk about, and I'd like to invite panelists to answer this verbally by raising your hand. And I'm going to invite everybody who's in the audience to answer this in the chat. There are two questions. One is, what did you learn this evening? And what did you enjoy? So I'm going to give you a second to think about that. And then panelists, whenever you want, feel free to raise your hands. Alex, you can go first.
I think it was really good for us to all hear that we really do have a lot of places where our thoughts and our feelings intersect, especially when it comes to how we're going to provide services for survivors and how we designate those survivors, how we talk about survivors. So I hope that we can have more conversations like this, because I think it's incredibly important for us to each not only understand where the other's coming from, but to dial down the rhetoric and the stuff and just see each other as people. I think it's really important when we're having these honest and open conversations to be able to have these chats. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great. Others. I'll go. And yeah, you can just raise your hand when you're ready. But I just want to say that I do this work with Braver Angels because I firmly believe that people with good hearts can disagree very seriously, and that we can learn from each other, and that we can say those things that we disagree about without that meaning that we have to be enemies. And what I see here was the same as what I saw at the beginning, which is 6 women who are passionately committed to supporting people in vulnerable and complex situations and helping them have the best lives that they can. And I still see that. I see it. I saw it at the beginning. I saw it when I talked to you in the pre-calls, and I see it now. And to be honest, some of the disagreement I see coming from that passion, from that desire to love those people well, to change our society so that it cares about those people, so that it sees them, so that they're not invisible, and so that they are given the freedom that we all deserve. And so I really enjoyed that, and it has been meaningful. Some of you know I volunteer on a sexual assault hotline, and so this whole subject is really meaningful to me. And I just want to say that this is a tough issue and a tough conversation, but I'm proud of us, all of us, for being part of it. And I think, yeah, it's been really meaningful for me. So I really appreciated it. Melissa, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I want to say that I have appreciated hearing from everybody on this, and I have respect for everybody on this panel. That said, what I've
this is
out,
what you learned and what you enjoyed. Yep.
What I did not enjoy was
so this is not actually, we're not doing critique right now. I'm sorry. I know you might want to, but for the moment, we're just going to stick with what did you learn and what did you enjoy?
What I did enjoy about this was that there is significant agreement on and please don't mute me, there's significant agreement. There's significant agreement among us about the issue of provision of services. This is a very hot issue. I hear the talk, but I don't see the walk on this issue. I would love to have a sit-down meeting where everyone on this panel who is committed to providing housing, job training, medical care, peer support, everyone who's interested in that say what they're willing to do. What are the SWOP advocates willing to ask George Soros and Bill Gates for? Are we willing to put our money where our mouth is? Are we willing to really ask these folks for money for housing? If we have common ground, I would love to put our heads together, because that would be a very powerful coalition if we could agree on demands for bottom line services for all women.
Thank you. That is true. I'm seeing some support for it in the chat too. Others, anyone else? What did you learn tonight and what did you enjoy? Rita.
Well, definitely one of the things that I learned is that as abolitionists, we need to communicate better, that we don't hate sex workers, that we don't abhor the work they do, that was a very strong language. That was really strong language, and it hit me because I am a person that is worried and that has very close relationships with women that are still in the life and that I get to spend time with and talk to and share experiences with, even though I've never been in the life. I can share these experiences with these people and I can create relationships and build relationships with them. And so maybe as an abolitionist community, we need to communicate this better and make it known, because it's not about abhorring their life or who they are or the choices that they make at all. It is about taking care of each other. It's about stopping violence against women. It's about making sure that all women are understood to be created equal and need equal care and equal love and equal support. And that it's not this over-representation of these vulnerable communities in such hard work. That's all I've seen. Prostitution is hard. It's difficult. It's painful. It's not always beautiful and pink and I just have never seen it. And so that's something that I learned today.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. One last chance, things that you learned, things that you enjoyed. Okay. Oh, Caitlin. Okay, we have two more, fine. Caitlin and then Vanita. No, it's good.
I learned that there's a lot of shared foundation. I think that we all believe that people, whether they've engaged in, the sex industry or not, deserve access to the building blocks we all need to move our lives forward, like housing and healthcare and basic services. And, recognizing that people without those things are very vulnerable to exploitation. I think we can stand against that as a group.
Absolutely. And Vanita, you get the last word, and then we'll do a poll so audience members can weigh in too. Go ahead, Vanita.
Really enjoyed that we really do all have a lot of good things in common. And I do think that it's given me hope that we really can get this movement even stronger by working together. And I just enjoyed hearing everybody's views, because people had said some things that I hadn't even thought of, ever. And really helps me to think about some things and to grow, move. So it was really a good conversation for me.
Wonderful. Glad to hear it. All right, Gretchen, if you would go ahead and launch our second poll of the evening. All right. So everyone, you have 1 minute to respond. All right, 5 more seconds. All right. Gretchen, if you would end it and share the results. Okay. Well, so there was a lot of good stuff. This is, again, a pretty divided split. So people thought that the truthfulness and honesty of opinions shared was really good. Another high one was just a deeper understanding of the issues, the passion of speakers, respect shown, and people sharing their personal experiences and stories. That's actually the highest one. And I'm not at all surprised by what I see next, which is that, let's see, that's over 70% say that what we heard tonight affects how we think about this issue, at least somewhat. It certainly affects how I think about the issue, I can tell you that. And 79%, yes, this is, see, this is really good. So I think probably a lot of folks walked in with one opinion, and almost 80% of us are feeling that walking out, we have more of a sense of how the other side thinks. You know, does that mean that our opinion has changed completely? Not necessarily, but I think that this is good. This is good. And this is how we can move issues like this forward. So we're going to stop sharing that for now. And I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there. This has been a wild ride. And I have, as I said, you know, I'm tempted to, I'm prone to like make light of things, but this has been really meaningful to me. And I know to a lot of the folks who are in the chat too, and who are watching. So a couple of final remarks. We're going to skip most of the admin stuff because I want to get you all to bed or to dinner if you're on the West Coast. And so if you're not part of Braver Angels, we need you. Please join us, go to braverangels.org. And this work is so important and we can't do it alone. We particularly need you on the debates team, but I'll let you just sign up for Braver Angels and then we'll recruit you to our team from there. And then the last thing is that we have a couple of really good debates coming up in January, one on capitalism, which has been mentioned tonight, and one on homelessness also. And so we will be sending the links out for those via email. And I just want to wish everybody a really good holiday.